Chapter 26. Frank, Candy, and Rich attended the Oscars to the media's surprise. No one expected them to be there, considering what had happened recently. There were rumors, plenty of rumors, but nothing substantial about what had happened to Roxanne Simon. The family was very close-mouthed about the conditions that had left her in a coma. The movie Bad Company was cleaning house, too. It had won 5 awards, and there were 3 left to be presented. 2 of these categories held nominations for Roxanne and Candy's movie. The time had come for the presentation of the Best Actress award. Candy was nervous. She hoped Roxanne won. But if she didn't, all Candy knew was she didn't want to win out over Roxanne. And the Oscar goes to... The presenter stalled, opening the envelope. Surprise pleasantly filled his face. "We have a tie. For Bad Company, Candy Simon." He paused while the crowd roared. If he didn't follow Candy's name with Roxanne's, this would end up a truly hollow victory, one she would absolutely hate. The presenter leaned toward the mic, his expression stoic, giving nothing away about the identity of Candy's co-winner. And again... He stalled again, dragging it out. Candy was ready to strangle him. "For Bad Company, Roxanne Simon." The crowd went wild. Tears pooled around Candy's eyes. She hugged Rich and then grabbed Frank's hand. "Come on," she said. "Come with me and accept on her behalf." Frank followed Candy up to the stage and waited patiently while she gave her acceptance speech. As Candy wrapped up her thank yous, he decided it was time to make his announcement to the world. Frank stepped up to the microphone and took a moment to eye the Oscar statuette. "I would like to thank all those people that Roxanne would have..." He continued to stare at the coveted prize. "But I don't know who they are." He laughed a little, having amused himself. "But thanks to all of you anyway. Whomever you may be." He waited for the applause to fade. "There's something I'd like to tell you all. Something that really doesn't have anything to do with tonight's event." He finally looked out at the audience. A hush fell over the entire auditorium. "As you all may know, my wife was recently hospitalized and remains in a coma. I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you all that Garrett Hollander is now officially disbanded." The audience gasped. "With due respect to my wife, I will no longer perform in concert or record any more albums." Saying what he had to say, Frank backed away from the podium. The audience mumbled, showing their disapproval. At the end of the evening, Bad Company was named Picture of the Year. But even as the announcement came, it was old news. Over the next few days, the Simon sisters and Garrett Hollander were the lead stories in just about every newspaper in the country. Back in Tampa, Frank scanned the front page of the Tampa Tribune with little interest. "Simon sisters win. Garrett Hollander quits." It came as no surprise when the Simon sisters' latest movie, Bad Company, swept the Oscars last night, and it was refreshing to find that both Roxanne and Candy tied for the Best Actress award. What was a surprise, though, was Frank Garrett's announcement to the world. Garrett, co-founder of the popular rock band Garrett Hollander, announced to the world last night that the group has officially disbanded. He went on to say that he would not perform at any more concerts or record any more albums. "We doubt the Academy cares about this at all, but they probably are very sorry to lose Roxanne Simon to a coma. Many of us will miss her fine performances. As for GH, the music world is devastated, and to all of the band's fans, of which I am one, it is a sorrowful day for us all. We will never hear any new music from the band, or have the opportunity to attend one of their concerts. However, there is one consolation for us. Aside from the 3 previous albums, GH is about to release their 4th and apparently final album. Thank you, Mr. Garrett, for leaving us with that much. Your public commends you, Frank, in your quest to show your wife proper respect. But to the band Garrett Hollander, we will miss you terribly." Hell, Frank thought. Who are they trying to kid? He threw the paper down on the table. Nobody really gives a damn. Frank went up to Roxanne's study. He took the discs out of the drawer and accidentally dropped them on the floor. Bending over to pick them up, he noticed a few spots of blood on the carpet. It must have dripped from Roxanne's hand when she was sitting at her desk that night. He went downstairs and gathered some cleaning supplies, intent on removing the stain from the carpet. Candy came in some time later, while Frank was on his hands and knees, scrubbing the floor with a sponge. "What are you doing?" she asked, walking around behind the desk. "There's blood on the carpet." Frank didn't look up. He continued to scrub at the stain. It probably dripped off her hand that night. "Frank!" Candy grabbed his arm. "Stop it." He jerked away. "Candy, I have to clean this up." He refused to stop. She went for the sponge. "Frank, you have to stop this." Frank looked up into Candy's worried green eyes. "I can't," he said helplessly. "You've got to stop avoiding the facts." "What facts?" "The fact that you can't deal with what's happened to Roxanne." She gave a quick, one-sided shrug. "The fact that you blame yourself and your music? Isn't that why you killed your guitar and quit?" "Killed my guitar?" He almost laughed. "It looked pretty dead when I saw it in the trash." "From the very beginning. If I hadn't made her feel like music was more important to me than her," he said with conviction, "then you and I wouldn't be racking our brains right now trying to write this book." He paused, content in reveling in his own self-condemnation. "She'd be here, alive and well and doing it herself, and I wouldn't feel like such a jerk." "Frank, you've got to stop this." Candy's tone didn't hide her concern. "You're going to drive yourself crazy." "Well, now," he said with a hint of laughter, "wouldn't that just be poetic justice?" "Excuse me?" "Don't you see?" He looked at Candy. "I did this to her. I drove her crazy." "Frank, you had no control over what happened." "Oh, yes, I did. And after all, he was the one who'd plotted and planned to drive her nuts." "You know what the worst part of all this is?" he asked, but he didn't wait for an answer. "It's the way this is affecting Frankie." The notion that Frankie would have such a hard time with the absence of his mother had never crossed Frank's mind. And now Frank hated himself for being the cause. "Frankie's a survivor," Candy said with a measure of certainty. "He has dreams about Roxanne, you know." Frank let it out. "He cries in his sleep for his mother. He wants her, and I can't give her to him." Candy wished there was something she could do or say to help Frank. But it was useless. Nothing would help Frank. Nothing short of Roxanne waking up. Frank dreaded going to bed that night. He knew at some point that Frankie's cries would wake him up. Every time it happened, it cut into his heart a little deeper. The worst part of all, there was nothing he could do to fix it. But this time, unlike all the others, Frankie's crying didn't rouse Frank until Frankie was standing over him, banging on his chest, beckoning him to wake up. "Mommy!" Frankie cried. "Mommy!" Frank realized the boy was still sleeping. "Frankie." Frank pulled him down onto the bed. "I want my mommy." Frankie sobbed, half awake now. Frank pulled him into his lap. "Frankie, you know your mother can't be with us right now. She's not well enough yet." "No!" Frankie wailed, kicking his feet. "I want my mommy." "Mommy's in the hospital right now," Frank tried to explain. "No, no, no!" Frankie continued kicking. "Daddy, please! I want my mommy!" Horrific thoughts flooded Frank's mind. "Oh God, what have I done?" Candy wasn't exactly confident in her ability to write Roxanne's book. She didn't feel she had a talent for writing, not like Roxanne. The best solution she could come up with was to try writing it the way she thought Roxanne would have. After printing out the portion she'd just completed, she handed the printed papers to Frank, who instantly began reading. From the autobiography. When Roxanne met Kirk Bronson, he was very married. Any fool could see that he was totally in love with his wife, Sarah. But he'd once said there was something about Roxanne that had captivated and mesmerized him from the moment he'd laid eyes on her. He'd only seen her the one time in Lyle's office. But even so, during the days that followed, he couldn't get her out of his mind. Still, at that point, Kirk didn't harbor any romantic delusions toward Roxanne. During his marriage to Sarah, he never made an attempt to carry on an affair with Roxanne. He simply wanted to be her friend. A few days after the initial meeting with Lyle Williams, Kirk phoned him up even though he was still apprehensive about acting. "Kirk," Lyle said into the telephone, "I hope you're calling to say that you've reconsidered our offer." "Well," Kirk paused, "I have been thinking about it." "When can we meet?" Lyle asked quickly. "There is one thing," Kirk said. "That young woman I met in your office the other day." "Roxanne? She wrote the novel." And then Lyle remembered that Roxanne hadn't been exactly nice to Kirk. "She'll be on the set quite a bit, but if that's a problem, we'll separate the two of you as much as possible." "No, I don't have a problem with her." "Wonderful," Lyle said, relieved. "By the way," Kirk said, "given that I can somehow manage to pull this off, who is my co-star?" "Well, that's where we're having a little trouble," Lyle admitted. "We just can't seem to find the right girl." A few weeks later, auditions were still ongoing for the role of Sherry Baker. Mainly out of curiosity, Roxanne decided to sit in on the auditions. Testing in one of the hospital room scenes, the actress reading wasn't doing it any better than the other four who'd come before her. In the scene, Ben lay sleeping in the hospital bed. Sherry was supposed to enter the room and drop the chart on the floor, in turn waking him. The chart's metal cover hitting the floor would startle him awake, causing Sherry to pretend concern. She was supposed to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," in a half-serious yet intentional way, and then add, "Did I wake you?" with a hint of insincerity. But this girl, like all the others, simply apologized and nothing more. Roxanne had seen enough. No, she hopped off the stool. "Sherry isn't really sorry. She dropped the chart on purpose, but in a playful sort of way." Deciding to show them how the line should be read, she said, "It's like..." She paused, preparing herself. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Did I wake you?" she said half-heartedly, on the verge of laughing. At that moment, the light bulb went off in Lyle's head, as well as the director's. After some gentle persuasion, they cast Roxanne Simon in the role of Sherry Baker in The Secret. With production already in progress, and Roxanne too pregnant to hide, they made plans to film her scenes after her baby's birth. In celebration, Roxanne and Candy joined Kirk and Sarah for lunch. They'd chosen a booth for the added privacy, with Roxanne and Candy on one side and Kirk and Sarah on the other. "Listen," Roxanne said to Kirk and Sarah, "since you both know I'm pregnant, I'm going to ask you not to say anything to anyone." "Not say anything?" Kirk didn't hide his confusion. "About what?" "My pregnancy," Roxanne said. "If that's what you want," Sarah agreed. "Believe me, the fewer people who know, the better." Roxanne choked back thoughts of Frank finding out. "How long do you think you can hide it?" Kirk asked, staring at her swelling tummy. "As long as I possibly can." Roxanne showed fortitude, but she knew she couldn't hide it forever. By the time Roxanne reached her 8th month of pregnancy, her delusions about Frank Garrett were emerging frequently. At any given time, her fantasies convinced her to believe that she wasn't in New York at all. In her mind, she was still in Florida, and she and Frank were still together. She didn't care about the present because she was quite happy living in the past. She may not always know where she was or the year, but she always knew who she was. During production of the movie, Roxanne, Candy, and Kirk often lunched at a nearby cafe. On this day, the three of them talked about and discussed the roles of Ben and Sherry. Things moved along fine until Roxanne reverted back into the past. Well, Candy dropped her napkin into her plate. I've got to get going. I'll see you later. Roxanne watched her leave and then turned to Kirk. You'd better go too. Frankie will be here any minute. He gets kind of jealous at times. Typically, that would have been enough to scare off the average guy, especially with the increasing frequency of these episodes. But not Kirk. She needed a friend, and he was determined to be that for her. Frank laid the manuscript down on the desk and massaged his forehead. After a moment, he looked at Candy. Is this all true? Every word. Does anybody know why this happened to her? Only in theory, she said. Jerry could only suppose that she couldn't let go of you. I should have been there for her. It's kind of hard to be there for someone when they won't let you. Her precise words pierced his ego. There's been more than one opportunity for me to be there for her. I should have been, but I wasn't. Candy gave him a challenging look that was quickly followed by a short, saucy smile. Tell me about when you guys went out to California and recorded the first album, she suggested, effectively changing the subject. How did you write your songs, anyway? How did I write my songs? That earned a soft chuckle. Well, yeah, for instance, Without Her. How did you come about writing that song? What exactly was it that prompted you? How do you think we came about writing it? He said snidely. You and Roxy left. We got drunk and wrote the song. We? Candy asked, surprised. Yes, we. Rich and I wrote that song together. Really? Apparently Frank was telling her something she didn't know. But with all the things she did know about Garrett Hollander, it only seemed logical that she would have known that Rich had co-authored many of the band's songs. Frank was surprised she didn't. Tell me about that, she asked with eager affection. Thinking back on the night they were on that infamous drunk, Frank could remember it so clearly, as if he were back there once again. From the autobiography. After hours, the bar was locked up tight. Only Frank, Rich, and the club's manager remained inside. Even the waitresses had taken off after a few failed attempts at throwing themselves at Frank and Rich. While the manager settled the evening's business, Frank and Rich had seized a table near the bar, bringing with them a bottle of Jack Daniels and 2 shot glasses. Pouring the whiskey, Frank said, Everybody thinks they know what's good for us, but they don't know shit. He passed a shot to Rich. Everybody says forget about her, Frank. He held the glass in his hand while naming all the well-intended lines of advice everybody had been giving him. You're better off without her. She wasn't the right girl for you. Now you can concentrate on your music. He mocked them all bitterly, then sucked down the shot. What we need, my friend, he said, banging the glass against the table, is another drink. He waited for no confirmation from Rich, just grabbed both glasses and poured 2 more. Here. He pushed a refill toward Rich. They gulped down the shots. What are we gonna do? Frank welcomed suggestions since he had no idea where to go from here. Rich thought about it for a second. We're gonna have another drink, he decided and banged his shot glass on the table. Frank poured 2 more shots, and they proceeded to drink their troubles away. Everybody's got their own opinions, and they all know what I can't seem to see. They tell me to shake it off and carry on. They downed another shot. I just don't understand it, Frank said, bewildered. Where did I go wrong? You're going to have to learn. Rich's thought trailed off as he held his empty shot glass out to Frank. More, please. Learn what? Frank poured 2 more. How to live without her. Yeah, well, Frank said with a slight snicker. If I could just forget about her, then maybe I could learn how to live without her. And I can't go on without her, although I've tried, and I can't forget about her. We're on our way, though, Rich said. Straight to the top. Yeah, but is this the way it's supposed to be? We'll get girls, Rich said melodramatically. Lots of girls. Gorgeous girls. Pretty girls. Frank joined in the fun and poured 2 more shots. That's good. But it's her face that keeps coming back to me, Rich said sadly. I go out and discover new places, but this isn't the way it was supposed to be. And I try to replace her with new faces, but it's her face that keeps coming back to me. I can drink away my sorrows, but my loss will stay for the rest of my tomorrows. They downed another shot, and Frank discovered the bottle was empty. Not only do I have to learn how to live without her, but all the damned whiskey's gone, too. Without her. Rich paused, deep in thought. That'd make a nice song. Let's get a bottle to go, Frank suggested. And let's go write ourselves a song. Frank looked at Candy. And that's pretty much the way it happened. You guys got drunk and wrote that song? She found that notion amusing. Sad but true. I'm surprised that either of you remember the conversation, she said, much less turned it into a song. Once again, Frankie's sobbing woke his father in the middle of the night. Frank lumbered out of bed and stumbled toward the boy's room. To his surprise, Frankie was sitting up, wide awake. Hey, buddy. Frank entered his room. What's up? He sat down on the edge of the bed. Daddy, Frankie said between sobs. Why won't you go get my mommy? Frankie, we've been through this before. Frank was a bit too tired tonight. Mommy's in the hospital. She's not in the hospital, Daddy. She is in the hospital, Frankie. No, she's not. She's at the water. Frankie's tears continued to fall. She is. I seen her, Daddy. Frank pulled his son into his arms. I know how much you miss your mommy. You want her to come home. So do I. He wished there was something he could say that would make Frankie feel better. But there wasn't. Nothing short of a lie, anyway. Frank wasn't going to go there. She can't come home. Not right now. And what you think you saw was just a dream. No, Daddy! Frankie refused to give in. She's at the water. Chapter 27. Candy was sitting at Roxanne's desk, typing away on the computer. The knock at the door didn't break her concentration. Come on in, she called out over her typing. She expected to see Frank, but was pleasantly surprised when Rich appeared in the doorway. He smiled at her. She pushed back from the desk. I'm glad you're here. I want to talk to you. What'd I do now? He wondered with a sharp laugh. Candy giggled. I want you to help us. Us? Frank and me. We're trying to finish Roxanne's book, and we've decided to put you guys in it too, she said. I figure it'd be wise to get a second opinion about what happened to you guys. This is a book about you and Roxy. Rich eyed Candy skeptically. Who cares what we did? Who cares? She questioned him aggressively. I care. Whether you like it or not, we're all a big part of each other's lives. And if we don't talk about you and Frank in the book, then we're not telling the whole story. Rich couldn't argue with that. How could Roxanne tell her story without discussing Frank Garrett? It'd be impossible. So, Candy handed him a batch of typewritten pages. Read this. From the autobiography. Garrett Hollander wrapped up their first album, and Frank tried his damnedest to replace Roxanne. He'd gone through girl after girl, but all of his efforts ended in vain. He'd even gone to the extreme of trying to personify Roxanne and other women. If their hair wasn't the right shade, he had them dye it until it perfectly matched the color of Roxanne's light chestnut brown hair. If their eyes were the wrong color, which they always were, He had them purchase violet-colored contact lenses in a hopeless effort to duplicate Roxanne's unusual eye color. If the girls were too thin or too heavy, he tried to readjust their weight accordingly. And for all his time and trouble, his plan proved useless every time because he couldn't teach any of them to act like Roxanne. Without Her claimed its place as the first single released from the album. Shortly after the song's debut, and before the album's actual release, the song sailed up the charts. Frank decided to acquire himself an image that was befitting a rock star. He entered the California motel room wearing his newly purchased Varnays. "So what do you think?" he asked, looking at Rich from behind the shades. "About what?" Rich was lounging on the bed watching TV. "The Varnays, aren't they great?" "Yeah." Rich gave him a passing glance. "I suppose they are." "It's my new image," and his new way of protecting himself. Roxanne had peered into his soul through his eyes. That's how she'd gotten to him. He had to prevent that from happening again. The best way he could think of was to cover his eyes. That's where the shades came into the picture. Meanwhile, in New York City, Roxanne was due to give birth any day. It was just after the first of the year, and she was miserable. She and Kirk were rehearsing scenes when she went into labor. Kirk took her to the hospital and immediately called Sarah. "Sarah, I don't know what to do," he told his wife over the telephone. "Did you reach Candy?" "No, I can't find her, but I did leave messages all over town." "Then you have to stay with Roxanne. She shouldn't be alone right now." "I'd always thought that the first child I'd see being born would be ours." Maybe Kirk didn't realize it. Not at that point, anyway. But a part of him truly didn't want to leave Roxanne's side. "Well, you don't have to actually watch her give birth," Sarah said dryly. "Just stay with her until Candy gets there. Or until they take her into delivery." They said their goodbyes, and Kirk went back to Roxanne's hospital room. Somehow being there with her didn't seem right. Probably because the baby wasn't his. Maybe, just maybe, deep down inside, Kirk secretly wished Roxanne's baby was his, even though he hadn't realized it yet. "Hey." Kirk smiled and took hold of Roxanne's hand. "How are you doing?" "Okay," Roxanne said weakly. "Except for those contractions that keep coming around." She tried to laugh, but it was hard. "Things are a little uncomfortable, huh?" Kirk took the wet towel from the stand and swabbed her forehead. "Did you find Candy?" "No, not yet." Feeling another pain, she tightened her grip on his hand. "Go ahead," he said. "Squeeze my hand if it helps." Roxanne tightened her grip on his hand as the contraction peaked. She tried to stifle a moan, but it escaped anyway. Thoughts of Frank Garrett flittered through her mind. "Frankie, where are you?" She needed him to get through this. The pain subsided, and Roxanne loosened her grip on Kirk's hand. "You handled that one like a pro," Kirk said, dabbing her forehead with the cool, moist towel. "So how many more do I gotta go through before I prove myself?" She tried to laugh, but didn't have much luck. "The fewer the better, right?" he said. "Believe me, I understand about pain." Roxanne was tired, and she just wanted to sleep. Knowing the pain-free interval would be brief, she closed her eyes. She could almost see Frank standing over her, even though, somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew it wasn't real. Still, the thought of him being there offered her a measure of comfort. Another contraction squeezed her belly like a vice grip. She opened her eyes and saw Kirk's sparkling brown eyes gazing down at her. But Kirk's eyes weren't the ones she wanted to see. She desperately needed to see those captivating, hypnotic baby blues. "I think you'd better get the doctor." The pain ripped through her. "I can't handle this anymore." "Frankie, where are you?" She needed him now more than she'd ever needed anyone in her whole life. If only Frank were there. He'd make it all okay. Kirk stood by as the hospital staff rushed Roxanne away. He couldn't do anything for her. He knew that. He'd seen it in her eyes. He wasn't the one she wanted or needed. In the delivery room, Roxanne was alone and frightened as one horrific pain after another ripped through her body and soul. She'd have given anything if Frank were there. "Okay," the doctor coached her. "Here comes the head, Roxy." "Don't you call me that!" "Okay, Roxanne," the doctor corrected himself. "Push. Push." Roxanne didn't know what to do. It's like she was in the dark, and Frank was the only one who could shed any light. "One more time, Roxanne," the doctor said. "Just once more. Push hard. Give it all you've got." Roxanne felt immense relief as the baby came out. Thank you, God. Finally, it was over. "It's a boy," she heard someone say. Within minutes of cleaning up the baby and wrapping him in a snug blanket, the nurse placed him in Roxanne's arms. A chill breezed through her as she held her son for the first time. Fighting the tears, she looked down at the baby. He opened his eyes and appeared to look up at her with hauntingly familiar blue eyes. Gently, she kissed his cheek and then hugged him. The delivery room doors burst open and Candy came rushing in. "Am I late?" she asked, surveying the room. When her eyes fell on Roxanne and the baby, she froze. "It's a boy," Roxanne said. Candy cooed and her eyes began to water as she reached out to touch him. "Would you like to hold your nephew?" Roxanne asked. Candy took the baby and cuddled him close. "Aren't you just the most precious little thing anybody's ever seen?" From that moment on, a bond formed between Candy and little Frankie. They would always be nephew and aunt, and nothing anyone said or did would ever change that. Rich laid the papers on the desk. His gaze traveled up to Candy, and he had this sad, faraway look in his eyes as he asked, "Has Frank read this?" "Yes," Candy nodded. "How did he react?" "Let's just say that..." She hesitated and shrugged. Now Frank has a different outlook on the time he and Roxanne were apart. "It didn't upset him that Kirk Bronson was with her while she was in labor?" "No." "That's odd. Why?" "Well, aside from the fact that Frank spent all those years thinking Kirk Bronson was Frankie's father, and Roxanne had been unfaithful to him." Rich paused. He wasn't comfortable discussing that part of Frank's past with anyone, not even Candy. "Without Her was nominated for a Grammy, as was Kirk's title track from your movie." Rich told Candy something she hadn't realized. "Anyway, we lost the award to Kirk's band, and that only fueled the fire for Frank. He's always considered Kirk Bronson his archenemy." When Frank showed up, Candy sent Rich and little Frankie out to get ice cream. She and Frank needed to talk. "So what are we working on today?" Frank asked. "Why didn't you tell me how you really felt about Kirk Bronson?" she asked casually. "That's not the issue. Considering how you truly feel about him, it's pretty remarkable that you didn't show the least bit of anger that he was with Roxanne while she was in labor with your son." "How I feel about Bronson is not important. He was a good friend of Roxanne, and he was there for her when she would have otherwise been alone. There's no just cause to be angry about that." Maybe Frank didn't feel the need to be angry anymore, because now he knew that even though Kirk was there with Roxanne, it wasn't enough. She wanted and needed Frank. He was the only one who could have made a difference. "Do you still hate him?" "With a passion." "You never cease to amaze me, Frank." She chuckled softly. "Have I told you about Frankie's dreams lately?" He wondered offhandedly. "No." "He's been having these dreams that Roxanne isn't in the hospital. He says she's at the water." "At the water?" Candy said, confused. "I think he wants her to recover and come home so badly that he dreams she's at the water because he knows she loves the beach." He gave his own interpretation of Frankie's dreams. "I guess this is pretty hard on him. Roxanne is all he's ever known." Candy tried not to fret about something she had no control over. She's always been there for him, and now she's not. "I hate myself for that." Would you stop with this self-hatred and blaming yourself?
It's my fault, you know. How many times do I have to tell you it's not your fault? Candy had grown tired of this game they seemed to be playing, day in and day out. Okay, Frank blurted out. I'm going to tell you the truth. And what I'm about to say will change your opinion of me forever. Knowing this, he continued. I hated Roxanne. I wanted to drive her crazy. I wanted her locked up in the nut house where I figured she belonged. I didn't marry her because I wanted to be reunited with my long-lost love. He saw the shock on Candy's face, but he didn't stop. I married her because I wanted her to pay for what she'd done to me, for keeping my son away from me. Frank was blaming himself for what had happened to Roxanne, and he figured everybody else should too. There was anger in his words, but it wasn't meant for Roxanne. He was furious with himself, and so far beyond being mad at her anymore. I wanted her to be locked away from me and my son. He paused to revel in a brief moment of self-loathing. I hate myself for what I've done to her, and Frankie. I'm so ashamed of myself. He waited for Candy to say something. He wanted her to yell, to scream at him, tell him he was a disgrace to the human race. Candy didn't yell. She thought about it. But Frank had already condemned himself more than she, or anyone else, ever could. And Roxanne's problems ran so much deeper than Frank deciding he was going to push her over the edge just because he thought he could. But with Roxanne's fragile state of mind, no one could have guaranteed what her reaction would have been, no matter what he'd said or done. I pray that someday I'll get the chance to tell her how sorry I am. She needs to know that she means everything to me.
Chapter 28. Surprisingly, to Jason anyway, Kirk had tracked him down all the way from London.
Hello, Kirk, he said coolly into the phone. How are you?
He asked politely, stalling. He knew why Kirk was calling. I heard about Roxanne, Kirk said, getting straight to the point.
You heard all the way in England?
Jason asked, still stalling. Tragic news has a way of crossing oceans. What happened to her?
She's in a coma.
I know that. His exasperation reached across the wire and stung Jason. How did this happen?
Well, we really don't know how it happened.
Jason lied easily. He wasn't about to admit to anyone, not even Kirk Bronson, that Roxanne had purposefully taken an overdose. I've heard the rumors. Kirk paused. Is that what happened?
What rumors?
Did she try to kill herself? Kirk was under the mistaken impression that Jason would tell him the truth.
That's ridiculous.
I'm coming to the States. Where is she?
No one can see her, Kirk.
Jason didn't want Kirk Bronson to come nosing around. Besides, if he showed up, that'd piss Frank off. Jason didn't need Frank pissed off. He liked him much better in his current guilt-ridden state. It kept him from making a nuisance of himself.
It wouldn't do you a bit of good to come.
She's going to need someone to be there for her when she wakes up.
To be honest with you, Kirk, the doctors aren't holding out much hope that Roxanne will ever wake up.
How can you say that? Of course she's going to wake up, and I'm going to be there when she does.
You don't know, do you?
It was more of a realization than a question for Jason.
You haven't heard.
Heard what?
Roxanne married Frank Garrett last fall.
Jason dropped the bomb, hoping it was enough to keep Kirk away. Of course, he knew that was wishful thinking. The weeks turned into months, and Roxanne's status never changed. Every time Frank phoned the hospital, the information was always the same. Roxanne remained in a deep coma. In the meantime, Frank, Candy, and Rich continued to work on Roxanne's book. The project provided the means by which each of them put off learning to deal with the fact that Roxanne wasn't an active part of their lives anymore, especially Candy and Frank. Candy listened diligently as Frank recalled the circumstances leading to the birth of his music.
The events surrounding his riding Wild She-Cat would surely test Candy's resilience. She had a hard time writing about what he'd told her, but she told herself that Roxanne would have been professional about the whole thing. So Candy pulled on her big girl panties and began work on the hardest scene in the book so far. When she handed the pages to Frank, she knew her version of the events would have to pass his standards. From the autobiography. California was a completely different world for Garrett Hollander. They'd been out west for a few months, but time had not healed the wounds for Frank Garrett. The hectic schedule of the bar tour did little to take his mind off his loss. He and Rich carried their luggage into one of the many motel rooms on the circuit, and neither of them paid any attention to the trash magazine on the dresser. "I'm going to go pick up some burgers," Rich said, once they'd brought their luggage inside. "You want the usual?" Frank nodded. "Sounds good." After Rich left, Frank decided he'd watch a little television. Maybe check out the news and see what was happening in the world. About to turn on the TV, he glanced past the magazine, having no desire to pick it up, much less read it. But something caught his eye, yanking his attention back to the tabloid a second time. In the top right-hand corner, he saw a small picture of Roxanne and some guy. The photo was small, but it still caught his eye. Shocked to see her picture on the cover of any magazine, he picked it up to take a closer look. He read the short inscription: Kirk Bronson and Amanda Cantrell. See page 28. He frantically searched for page 28, curious about the fake name. Of course, the stage name had been used solely to elude Frank. We know now that didn't work out too well. Frank scanned the brief paragraph about Roxanne. British rocker Kirk Bronson and newcomer Amanda Cantrell are set to co-star in The Secret, due to hit theaters in the fall. The movie is based on a novel written by Miss Cantrell and is expected to be one of this year's surprise hits. Frank snapped the paper shut and looked back at the picture. She'd obviously been looking at the camera, but he was looking at her. Frank could easily guess what the guy must have been thinking at that moment. Hell, he'd been there before. Frank was an expert. "You're looking at her, but she's looking away. Have I got news for you?" Frank squeezed the tabloid and stared at the photograph. Jealousy and anger surged inside. "It's going to cost you. Nothing is free here today. She does her best work under the cover of night." "Yeah," Frank said softly, as if he were actually talking to Kirk. "You think you got it made, don't you?" He tightened his grip, gently tearing the magazine's edges. "You don't know what you're getting into," he warned his adversary. "But I know what's going to happen to you. I know because I've been there before." "You better leave her alone. You better call it a day. Listen to what I'm telling you, 'cause money is her way." "Don't let her beauty blind you," Frank said. "I did, and you see where it got me." His anger with Roxanne escaped in his voice. "She's got one thing on her mind, and that's money." He wanted to kill them both. "You better watch your back, boy." "I thought I could make her see. I thought she would give it all up. I thought she would do it for me. I've been a fool." Frank drew his premature conclusions at the time, even though he was a little bit ahead of himself. But then again, maybe he did sense that there was more to this than meets the eye. Frank's gaze drifted up to Candy's and held her attention in silence. Finally, after what seemed like a whole month of silence, he said, "I like it." Candy sighed. "There's more," she said anxiously. "About Roxanne." When she was sure he had a hold of his emotions, she handed him another batch of printed text. From the autobiography. After Frankie's birth, the realization finally hit home that Roxanne was going to be in a movie that would potentially be seen by millions of people. She got scared, fearing that Frank might see her, or hear her name mentioned somewhere and come after her. Lyle, worried about losing his star, assured Roxanne that if she used a stage name, she would be safe from discovery. He let her know it wasn't that uncommon and everybody did it all the time. He made it sound so logical when he suggested that nobody really knew who any of these people truly were. Hence, Amanda Cantrell was born. The name actually had more meaning than just being a stage name to hide behind. Amanda Cantrell was the name of Roxanne's maternal grandmother. Candy was cast in a small part in the movie. She didn't want to break the sister relationship, so she also dubbed the last name Cantrell. Roxanne's scenes began shooting when Frankie was about 6 weeks old. By this time, Without Her had broken the top 20 on the music charts. Sadly, it didn't break the top 10. Other singles were released from Garrett Hollander's first album, including Roxanne, but none of them were destined to break into the top 10. Not at this time. Garrett Hollander had thought they were headed to the top, but unfortunately their first album was labeled a flop. Luckily, their contract called for one more album. Kirk didn't find out the identity of the baby's father until he and Roxanne were well into filming their scenes for The Secret. It happened one day when Roxanne and Candy had joined Kirk and Sarah for lunch. "Why are you using a stage name?" Sarah was curious. By now, she felt comfortable around Roxanne and didn't have a problem nosing into her husband's co-star's business. "Well," Roxanne hesitated. Perhaps it was better to admit the truth and then beg for discretion. "I don't want Frankie's father to find me." "He didn't know you were pregnant when you left, right?" Sarah said, as if she were trying to get the story straight. "No," Roxanne said. "What made you decide to leave without telling him?" Sarah wondered about this because she knew Roxanne was still in love with her baby's father. Her mental instability proved that. "He wouldn't be where he is today if I'd told him," she said. "He would have quit the band to take care of us." "Huh?" Now Sarah was confused. She thought she knew everything there was to know about this Frank fellow. She stood corrected. "Frank is Frank Garrett of Garrett Hollander," Candy said with a tight smile. "Surprise." "What?" Kirk nearly choked. "Really?" Sarah was too awed to pay much attention to Kirk's reaction, and she didn't understand Roxanne's reasoning. Frank Garrett made women everywhere swoon, and Roxanne Simon had not only dumped him, but she'd run out on him. Kirk had a different opinion. He resented Frank Garrett, although he didn't realize it at the time. In his eyes, Frank wasn't worthy of Roxanne. Roxanne had said that Frank had been mean to her, and he didn't like the idea of anybody being mean to Roxanne, for any reason whatsoever. The Secret opened in October. Lyle had Kirk escort Roxanne to the premiere for publicity purposes. Roxanne sat silently through the entire movie. She was secretly impressed with herself, proud over the fine performance she'd given. Outside the theater, the press lurked about, eager for those affiliated with the film to come out and talk to them. One reporter in particular, Max Belair, had a few questions for Miss Cantrell. He'd done some research on her and learned a lot in the process. For instance, he knew her name wasn't really Amanda Cantrell. He knew her name was actually Roxanne Simon. He also knew she'd had a lengthy affair with Frank Garrett, co-founder of the rock band Garrett Hollander. He found it curiously odd that she'd mysteriously left him more than a year ago. But the most intriguing thing of all, Roxanne Simon gave birth to a bouncing baby boy just after the first of the year. Now, Max never claimed to be a math whiz or anything, but if his calculations served him correctly, then he'd bet that Roxanne's kid belonged to Frank Garrett. Roxanne and Kirk exited the theater, and Max pushed his way up to the front of the crowd. While all the other reporters called her Amanda and asked questions about the movie, Max called to her ever so softly, "Roxanne." His use of her real name caught her attention right away. "Has Frank Garrett seen the baby yet?" he questioned her fearlessly. Roxanne froze. But she wasn't the only one who'd heard Max. Kirk had heard him too, knowing the importance of Frank never suspecting for a second that Frankie was his son. Kirk stepped up to the plate without giving a second thought about the consequences. "Why would Frank Garrett want to see my son?" Every reporter in attendance heard Kirk's proclamation loud and clear. Roxanne couldn't deny or confirm it. All she could do was stand there, dumbfounded. Sarah Bronson was a forgiving woman. In the past, she had forgiven many of her husband's mistakes. But this one was asking too much. Not that she believed his declaration because she knew it wasn't true. However, the public humiliation turned out to be more than Sarah could bear. As a result, the Bronson 6-year marriage ended in divorce. Even though Garrett Hollander's first album didn't do as well as expected, financially, the song Without Her was nominated for a Grammy, and it was in competition with Kirk Bronson's title track from the movie The Secret. When the Academy Award nominations came around, The Secret's nomination totaled nods in 6 categories. The movie received recognition for Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Director, Best Screenplay, and Best Song. When the Grammys were awarded, Frank lost to Kirk. When the Oscars were presented, Kirk accompanied Roxanne and Candy to Los Angeles. Their stay in California equaled less than 24 hours, but Roxanne was scared to death of running into Frank. After all, he was out there on tour. Somewhere. Mark Ryan, recipient of last year's Best Actor award, taunted the audience. "Oh, you guys don't really want to know who it is, do you?" He stuffed the card back into the envelope. Some attendees spoke up, telling him differently. "Okay, all right, I'll tell you." He paused briefly, tearing into the envelope again. "Amanda Cantrell for The Secret." Amanda Cantrell. Roxanne sat there stunned, until she realized that was her. Somehow she made it up on the stage. "I wasn't expecting this," she said breathlessly, gazing out at the audience. "But thank you all so very much." She looked down at the audience and saw Kirk sitting beside her empty seat. She wished Frank were there. "First, I'd like to thank Lyle Williams and Martin Ford, both of whom convinced me that I could do this part, and Jason Fisher. Without him, there never would have been a book, much less a movie called The Secret." She paused, admiring the statuette in her hand. "And my sister Candy." She looked at her. "Can you believe it?" Roxanne's heart was about to pound out of her chest. She drew in a breath. "And last but not least, I'd like to thank someone who's very near and dear to my heart. Unfortunately, I don't get to see you anymore, but you were the spark that ignited the flame for The Secret." She almost choked on the words and forced the negative feelings out with a hoarse, rumbling cough. "Thank you all," she said, finding the strength to wrap her acceptance speech up gracefully. "And anyone else I might have forgotten." Roxanne stepped away from the podium. The thought to acknowledge Kirk Bronson, her co-star, never crossed her mind. Frank looked at Candy. "Who was it?" "Who was who?" "Who was she talking about at the Oscars?" "Who do you think, numbskull?" Candy laughed at him. Not with him, but at him. "Who do you think?" Frank mocked her. "If I knew, I wouldn't be asking you." "Who was the one person that pushed her to write?" she questioned him. "The one who supported her and constantly offered her reassurance." Frank's blank stare reached out and grabbed a hold of Candy. "You, Frank!" Candy rolled her eyes, her patience about to snap. "Me?" he asked with an unbelievable innocence. Turning away, he looked out the window. He was sitting in her chair, and he wondered how many times Roxanne had sat here, staring out of this very same window. There was a lot to see outside. "Are you going to be okay?" Candy asked, as if she could see his inner struggle, the one he thought he'd kept hidden away. He let his gaze linger on the scene outside the window and then slowly turned back to Candy. "I really don't know," he said truthfully. "She's been in the coma for months now, but it's not getting any easier to deal with. If it weren't for Frankie, I wouldn't care if I lived or died." "Frank, you've got to be strong," Candy snapped at him. "For your son." "I'm not going anywhere if that's what you're worried about," he said. "I deserve to live in the hell I've created." "Maybe you should talk to someone," she suggested. Maybe you should talk to Jerry. Frank cackled. I'm not talking to that fruitcake. Frank, Candy said, we all love Roxanne dearly. We all miss her, and we want her to wake up. But you're in way over your head. She shrugged and bit into her bottom lip. You can't go on like this. Candy, I know you mean well. He gave her the benefit of a doubt. But pouring my heart and soul out to someone about how much I love Roxanne and how much I hate myself for what I've done to her, and our son. He shook his head. Is not going to happen. Well then, I suppose if you're ever lucky enough to see my sister standing before you again, then you should remember this. And whatever you do, you'd better swallow your silly pride and try your damnedest to convince her that you really do love her. She paused, seriousness washing over her expression. But I'll tell you this. Her tone followed suit with its own form of sincerity. If I ever see you treating her the way you have in the past, I'll cut you down and blow you out of the water. She was so serious it was kind of cute, and it almost cut the tension. Almost. And you're assuming that she's going to wake up. I pray for that every minute of every day. But even God is condemning me. The way Frank saw it, if everything he'd learned as a kid was true, then God had the power to heal Roxanne, and Frank had been begging him to do just that. But God wasn't listening. Even he must be thinking Frank didn't deserve to have Roxanne back in his life. Chapter 29. Candy and Rich had begun a daily ritual inside Roxanne's study, where they'd work on the book. As usual, she waited anxiously for the hard copy as it came off the printer. I heard Glenn and Ronnie started a new band, she said, making small talk. They did, he answered. Did they ask you to play with them? Yes. So why'd you turn them down? Well, Candy, it's all about loyalty. He was certain she could understand that. See, Garrett Hollander was, is, and always will be a team. If I joined them, it'd be too much like Garrett Hollander. The next thing you know, we'd be playing Garrett Hollander's music. And there's something wrong with that? She asked as if it were a trick question. If playing our music hurts Frank, then I can't be a party to it being played. I see, she said slowly. I suppose loyalty isn't always a good thing, is it? It may not always make you happy, he said. But if you're not loyal, then you probably don't have many friends. So what you're saying is, no matter how misguided your loyalty is, you should always remain faithful to your friends? You wrote the book on that one, didn't you? I guess I did. Got any more for me to read? He asked, wanting desperately to change the subject. Candy gathered up the papers and gave him a smile as she handed them to him without a word. From the autobiography. Shortly after the Academy Awards, Roxanne and Kirk began their ill-fated affair. Their time together was bittersweet and very short. It was sad, really, the two of them. First, because Kirk truly loved Roxanne. Maybe he had all along, he just hadn't realized it. And Roxanne wanted someone to make her feel the way Frank Garrett had. She convinced herself Kirk was capable of doing that. In the end, it didn't matter what Kirk did or said because Roxanne couldn't put Frank out of her heart or her head. Kirk knew it too. The end came swiftly. They'd gone out to dinner and neither of them went to the restaurant to call it quits. But fate took a hand and gave their breakup a little push. Roxanne and Kirk were tucked away in a dark, secluded corner of the restaurant that was illuminated only by candlelight. There was no one there to bother them. No one to intrude upon them or interfere with what was about to happen. Kirk sipped his wine and gazed at Roxanne. He would have married her and raised her son as his own. But she wouldn't hear of it. He'd asked her to marry him, and she'd turned him down flatly. She'd made it clear she wouldn't teach her son a lie. And telling Frankie that Kirk was his father would be a lie. No one can say we didn't try, Kirk said. Lord knows we tried, she agreed with a feeble smile. Probably harder than we should have. Roxanne reached across the table for his hand. Hurting him was the last thing she wanted to do, and she hated that it was happening. But what else could she do? Staying with him wasn't fair to either of them, especially Kirk. He knew, just as she did, that she couldn't give him the love he deserved or needed. Besides, they both had to get on with their respective lives. Kirk had a European tour coming up, and Roxanne's second novel, Always and Forever, was on the bestseller list, and Lyle was putting together a cast for the movie. Again, Roxanne would be his star. But this time, Kirk would not be her leading man. Lyle had said he had to give her a new co-star because she couldn't afford to be typecast with Kirk Bronson. "You do know that in my own way," she felt the need to say, "I do love you." "I know." He forced a smile. "You're just not in love with me." "I tried to be. I really did." "It's not your fault that you can't stop loving him." He attempted to let her off the hook. "Why can't I?" She wanted desperately to know the answer to that one. She'd tried everything imaginable to stop loving Frank Garrett, but nothing ever worked. She woke up each morning loving Frank more than the day before. "Roxanne." Kirk broke into her thoughts. "Have you ever thought about going back to him?" "It's too late for that," she said. "Besides," she laughed skeptically, "who says he'd have me back?" "Do you ever listen to the radio?" He laughed, as if he found her response comical. "There's not a song that he's ever sang that wasn't about you." "It almost sounds like you're rooting for him." She couldn't help but be surprised by that notion. "Maybe I am. Maybe deep down inside, I know he's the only one that'll ever make you happy." Roxanne knew that to be true. She also hadn't overlooked the fact that Frank hated the ground she walked on. No matter how much she may wish for things to be different, she knew it was too late. Production for Always and Forever started just after Frankie's second birthday. Lyle had been impressed with Candy's performance in the first movie, so he had her test for a bigger part in the new movie. Ultimately, she won the role of the other woman. This would prove interesting as well as challenging for Roxanne and Candy to portray enemies. Lyle managed to sign David Faulkner as the man they would be fighting over. David, a well-respected and very sought-after actor, was a big triumph for Lyle. Roxanne had gone to his office, where she and Candy were supposed to meet David. Entering, she saw him standing there with his back to her. A haunting chill rushed through her as she gazed at the tall, thin, dark-haired figure that reminded her of Frank. David turned around and smiled when he saw her. "Amanda Cantrell." He extended his hand to her. She returned the smile, easing her hand into his. Unable to take her eyes off of him, she studied his face. It was similar to Frank's, and those eyes, those same blue eyes. Although quite similar, they weren't really the same. It's more likely that it was Roxanne's fantasy to look into David's eyes and see Frank's. Right away, Roxanne took to David because he reminded her of Frank, even though David had at least 10 years on him. But to Roxanne, he was like an older, more mature version of the man she'd been trying so desperately to get over. David had one thing going for him that Frank lacked. David was not a musician. While Roxanne became acquainted with her second co-star, Garrett Hollander's second album hit #1 on the charts. 3 singles from the album had made it to the #1 spot, with the promise of more to come. And finally, the public couldn't get enough of Garrett Hollander. By the time the filming of Always and Forever ended, David had revealed that he'd fallen in love with Roxanne. She declared her love for him too, but in reality it was only a memory that she loved. She tried to tell herself that she loved David for himself, and not because he reminded her of someone. Garrett Hollander swept the Grammy nominations. When the awards were presented, they stole the show. They were rewarded 3 times, including the coveted Album of the Year award. Finally, Frank Garrett was right where he wanted to be, but it was lonely at the top. No matter what he did to change it, in the end he was always alone. Nothing or no one could fill the emptiness Roxanne had left him with. The Oscar nominations were no different than the last time Roxanne Simon had been there.
Except this time there were more nods, 8 in all. When the awards were presented, Always and Forever claimed 6. Roxanne walked away with 2 awards that evening, Best Actress and Best Screenplay. Candy joined in the revelry, claiming the Best Supporting Actress title. Roxanne and Candy had successfully portrayed enemies, proving their worth in Hollywood. On that night, their efforts had been rewarded. In New York City, a late snow fell in April that year. With the inclement weather came the end of Roxanne and David's affair. In Central Park they walked together, hand in hand with the snow falling steadily. "You know that I have to leave," David said softly, regrettably. "Yes, I do." Roxanne kept her focus straight ahead. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry." Still, neither of them looked at the other. "Just be happy for the time we've shared." "I will never forget you." "I hope you don't." "Will you stay for Candy's birthday party?" Finally, she looked at him. "It's the day after tomorrow." "Of course I will." He smiled. "It must be great to know you two have each other to count on." "Candy and I have been friends forever, and that's the way it'll stay." "That's good," he said. "I'll feel much better knowing I'm leaving you in good hands." Roxanne didn't say anything. She just looked the other way. She felt like crying, although she wasn't sure why. Maybe because she'd wanted David to fill the void Frank had left her with. But it never happened. In the end, David, just like Kirk, deserved more than Roxanne could give. "Listen." He stopped and faced her. "If you ever need anything at all, you call me." "I might just do that someday." She laughed softly, wishing things could have turned out differently. "Years and years from now, I just might call you up and ask you to do something for me." "All you have to do is ask," he said, "and it's done." Inside Roxanne and Candy's New York apartment, Candy stared out of the window at the falling snow, hanging onto an unopened beer. Watching the snow float down to the streets below, she thought about Rich and how he used to make her laugh. She didn't pay much attention to the DJ on the radio, announcing a new one from Garrett Hollander. As the song started, she quickly took notice because she knew it was Rich singing. "She was the light that showed me the way in the dark." Candy stared at the radio and twisted the cap off the beer. Nothing like having your mistakes thrown in your face on a daily basis. She threw the cap at the stereo. Rich continued to sing. "But now she's just the pain that burns inside my heart. She wanted something that I couldn't give her, so she figured we were better off apart." Candy looked out the window again. She knew Frank had most likely written the song, but it felt like Rich was singing about her. Why couldn't he understand? She had to do what she did for Roxanne. She had to stand by her friend. But still, it was times like these when she missed him the most. And it would creep up on her when she least expected it. Like now. Love is not the issue. It never matters at all. I bet if you ask her, she'll make the call. You'll need money, or it'll be your turn to fall. Rich laid the papers on the desk and paused before finally looking at Candy. "Are you just saying all that for my benefit? Or is it true?" "It's true," she said with a defined nod. He massaged his temples. "What?" she asked in a shaky voice. "You know, I held a lot of animosity toward Roxanne for such a long time for what she'd put Frank through. And now?" "Now," he said, looking a little lost. "Now I just feel really sorry for her. I had no idea she had such a self-conflicting struggle about the whole thing." "Just goes to show. There are 2 sides to every story." "Can I ask you a personal question?" "Sure," she said. "You can ask." But she might not answer. "We've read about Roxanne's love affairs.
What about yours?
Candy didn't say anything, just shook her head slowly.
So,
he tried to cap the urge to laugh.
You've remained celibate all these years?
Don't push your luck, she chuckled.
Well, one good thing has come from all this.
And what would that be?
I can still make you laugh.
He winked at her. You know, Candy said, a bit more serious now. It's funny.
What is?
Well, Roxanne always wanted something from Frank that she couldn't get. She hesitated, seeing the irony. Yet she had 2 other men who were dying to be whatever she wanted, especially Kirk. He would have given anything if Roxanne could have given her heart to him. A wave of sadness hit Candy. Rich wasn't exactly comfortable discussing Kirk Bronson or David Faulkner. If he talked about them with Candy, then he was also acknowledging them as Frank's rivals. Somehow that seemed disloyal. Instead, he decided to change the subject.
By the way, when did you guys buy this house?
When you guys were touring Europe. We didn't stay here long. Rocky was afraid that Frank was going to magically appear from out of nowhere.
Funny thing is, if he'd known for a second, just once, where to look for her.
Rich's words trailed off. It was senseless to think about what if. It was much too late for that. While Roxanne and Candy collaborated to write Bad Company, Garrett Hollander recorded their 3rd album. The phenomenal success of the 2nd album won the band new fans. Record sales for the 1st album began to skyrocket, too. That year, GH had 2 albums in the top 10. Roxanne and Candy formed Simon Productions and produced their first film, while Garrett Hollander's popularity continued to rise, and they accepted more Grammys for their 3rd album. Well, we've got the basic groundwork down for the book, Candy said. Now all we have to do is figure out how to end this thing.
Are we going to make it public knowledge that Roxanne took an overdose?
Rich said anxiously. Well, Candy hesitated. She wanted the truth to be known. She looked to Frank for an answer. Let's not forget that she had a different ending for this story. Her death, Frank reminded them.
Personally, Rich said, I think we should just say that Frank and Roxanne got back together and eventually married. I think if we're going to tell anything even remotely close to the truth, it should be that it was an accident. And as of publication of this book, she's still in a coma.
Candy thought about it. I agree. Aren't you two forgetting something? Frank questioned them. What? They both said in unison. You two really want to end this book and leave everybody hanging?
Well, Rich said defensively, Roxanne is the one who's in a coma.
He added, as if the cliffhanger had nothing to do with him. I'm not talking about Roxanne, Frank said. I'm talking about you two.
Us? Candy asked innocently.
In case you two haven't noticed, Frank said.
There is a romantic subplot here involving the 2 of you.
Rich and Candy looked at one another, then at Frank, then back at each other. Their snorting laughter filled the air. Candy looked at Frank. A romantic subplot? She looked at Rich again, and they snickered together. Frank ignored their cavalier attitudes.
It would be nice if the 2 of you would give us a happy ending to work with. Besides,
he shrugged, knowing exactly how to get to Candy. I think that's what Roxanne would want. Oh, damn, Candy moaned. No way she could fight it now. Rich said nothing, but given the smile curling at the corners of his mouth, he got it that Frank had done him a tremendous favor. Later that night, Frankie wandered into his parents' bedroom in search of his mother. He pounded Frank's arm.
Daddy, wake up!
What? Frank moaned, struggling to awaken. Then he realized Frankie was standing over him. That woke him instantly. What's the matter? He asked, but he could easily guess.
I want my mommy,
Frankie cried. Frank sat up and lifted Frankie onto the bed. I tell you what,
he said, wrapping his arms around the boy. "Tomorrow, I'll call Jerry. I'll tell him that you and I have to go see your mommy."
Frankie's eyes widened. "We're gonna go to the water to get her?"
"No," Frank said, keeping calm. "We're going to go see her at the hospital. Remember, your mommy's sleeping and nobody can wake her."
The last thing Frank wanted was to give Frankie false hope. "She's not at the hospital, Daddy," Frankie insisted. "She's at the water."
In the beginning, Frank thought that letting Frankie see Roxanne in her present state was a bad idea. But at this point, he figured it was better to let him see her in the coma, rather than having him continue with this fantasy that she was conscious and at the beach somewhere. Because it was, after all, only a fantasy. And somehow, some way, Frank intended to get inside that hospital to prove it.
"But Frank," Jerry argued across the telephone wire, "you know what Roxanne's power of attorney says."
"If that's the only card you've got, save it. I don't give a damn about that."
Frank's anger barreled across the airwaves.
"I'm going to take this kid to see his mother, and I'm going to show him that she's in the hospital and not conscious at the beach somewhere."
"What?"
Jerry blurted out. "You heard me. You best get me in that damn place. Now. Let me talk to Jason. I'll see if we can set something up for the 1st of next week. Sooner is better." Frank slammed the receiver down onto the phone's cradle. The nerve of that guy. The nerve of the two of them, both Jason and Jerry. Who did they think they were? Did they really think they could keep him away from her forever?
Chapter 30. On a nice, warm November afternoon, Rich and Candy were grilling steaks in his backyard. A crisp breeze blew in from the lake, carrying with it the scent of jasmine.
"I've given this a lot of thought," Candy said, playing with the meat on the grill. "What's that?" Rich said vaguely, while relaxing in a lawn chair. Idly, he was taking in the scenery around the lake. What to give Frank for his birthday? She hadn't overlooked the fact that Frank's birthday was also his and Roxanne's first anniversary. "So what's your surprise?" Rich asked, paying more attention now. "I think we should give him what he wants." "What he wants is for Roxanne to wake up." Besides that, he wants you and me to get married." Rich didn't give much thought to the idea since he knew marriage wasn't in Candy's cards. "Well," she said with a mischievous smile, "why don't we go get ourselves a marriage license then?" "Jeez," Rich laughed nervously. "What kind of a romantic are you? You don't just say, 'Why don't we go get a marriage license?' Somebody should propose to somebody." "Okay." She dropped to her knees. "What are you doing?" He questioned her with an anxious laugh. "Get up." "Would you just shut up? I'm trying to ask you to marry me." The shock of what she was doing hit him full force. Candy was serious. "Richard Hollander," she slipped her hand around his, "would you do me the honor of becoming my lawfully wedded husband?" Rich looked at her intently. Seeing those emerald green eyes sparkle with sincerity gave him assurance that everything was going to be okay. "Candace Simon," he said, tossing out a serious tone, "if you try to back out of this, or if you decide to run away and disappear, there will be no place on earth where you can hide from me. I will hunt you down if it takes the rest of my life." They laughed playfully. Rich pulled her into his lap. "I love you, girl," he said, running his fingers through her golden blonde hair. Candy wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "I've always loved you. I just never deluded myself that I could replace you." She brushed her lips against his. "Jerry," Jason said nervously into the telephone, "we have a problem." "You're telling me," Jerry said with biting laughter. "Has he called you too?" "Frank?" "No. Kirk Bronson." "Kirk Bronson?"
Jerry wasn't talking about him. In fact, he hadn't given Kirk much thought in years. Not since Roxanne stopped talking about him. Yes, Kirk keeps calling me. He's eager to come to the States to see Roxanne, even though I keep telling him that nobody can see her. Just ignore him. I've been avoiding his calls for about a week now, but it's only a matter of time before he shows up here in New York, or maybe even there in Florida. I have a news flash for you, my friend, Jerry said. Kirk Bronson is the least of our worries. What? Jason didn't like the sound of that. Frank Garrett has insisted upon taking Frankie to see his mother. I put him off until next week, but he's determined. Jerry was still in awe over Frankie's perception. It seems that little Frankie contends his mother isn't in the hospital at all. He says she's conscious and somewhere at the beach. And Frank is determined to take him to the hospital and show him differently. You're kidding. Where did Frankie come up with something like that? Apparently he's been dreaming it. Frank felt lucky that Rich and Candy had decided to get married on his birthday. That way, he had something to preoccupy himself with, rather than having all the time in the world to think about the fact that he and Roxanne were unable to celebrate their first anniversary. Rich and Candy got themselves a marriage license, and since there was no waiting period in Florida, they were free to marry immediately. They found a justice of the peace who came to Rich's house to perform the ceremony. Their wedding, like Frank and Roxanne's, was a small gathering. In the end, aside from Frank and little Frankie, the only other people in attendance were Jameson, Rose, Glenn, and Glenna. Who gives this woman? The judge asked, breaking into Frank's concentration. Or was it self-pity? You can skip that part, Rich said. Wait a minute. Frank butted in, not about to miss the chance for a little fun. Who gives this woman? He laughed skeptically. Hell, we're not giving her away. Frank glanced at Rich. He swore there were tiny little fire-tipped daggers shooting out from Rich's eyes. It made Frank's laughter rumble inside. We might trade her for a good amp or something, Frank said, willing to bargain. But we're definitely not giving her away. The judge cast a startled look over the faces of the guests, as if to say, someone please take control of this man. Candy started giggling. After that, everyone laughed. Go ahead, Frank said on the verge of laughter. Marry them. Within moments, Rich and Candy were pronounced husband and wife. I guess this sort of makes us brothers-in-law, doesn't it? Frank said, witnessing the marriage license. Guess we're stuck with each other now, Rich said with a smile. Candy noticed Glenna had wandered off, and now she was standing alone with her head hung low. Glenna, she said, going to her side. What's wrong? This may seem selfish of me, Glenna said slowly, but this just reminds me of how much I really miss the band. We all do, Candy said. But Frank refuses to play anymore, and Rich is determined not to play if Frank won't. Candy and Glenna both knew there was only one person who could put the band back together again, but she wasn't there. Damn it! Glenna's frustration blew out with her words. Why doesn't she come back to us? She searched Candy's face for some hint of comfort. Nobody wants that more than me, Candy said. Except maybe Frank. After talking to Jerry, Jason caught the first flight to Tampa. If he got out of New York before Kirk Bronson showed up, he'd consider himself lucky. But Jason had more important things to worry about right now, like the fact that Frank expected to see his wife, next week at the latest. With this turn of events, Kirk's nosiness seemed a bit trivial. Of course, he might have felt differently had he known Kirk was headed to Tampa at that very moment. Jason rushed into Jerry's office. Are you ready? I've been waiting on you, Jerry said. Well, let's get to the airport then. Our plane leaves in an hour. Once Kirk arrived in Tampa, he rented a car and headed for the address he'd found for Jerry's office. He couldn't get any information on the hospital Roxanne was in, but he'd get the address out of Jerry one way or another. He laid his hand on the handle, preparing to open the car door when he saw Jerry and Jason rushing out of the building. What was Jason doing here? And where were they in such a hurry to go? Kirk decided to follow them. He was surprised when he ended up following them back to the airport. Trailing them inside, he watched them board a flight headed for Kingston, Jamaica. What the hell is going on? He watched their plane take off and tried to make some sense of what he'd witnessed. Vaguely, he remembered Roxanne once saying something about Jason having a vacation home in Jamaica. A little voice inside Kirk's head urged him to follow them. Kirk went to the ticket counter. "When is the next flight to Kingston?" he asked casually, even though he had no clue why he was considering going there.
"We don't have another flight until tomorrow morning," the ticket agent replied. "Would you like me to check the other airlines for you?"
"Yes, please." He gave her a flirtatious smile.
"You're in luck. Delta has a flight leaving in an hour."
A starstruck look crossed her face, suggesting she recognized him.
"Would you like me to book you a seat?"
"Yes, thank you." Kirk grabbed his ticket and boarding pass, then headed for the cocktail lounge to have a drink while he waited to board his flight. There was something fishy about the whole thing with Jason and Jerry. Kirk couldn't put his finger on it, but he was determined to find out what. He'd forgotten something, though. Something he hadn't realized until he got off the plane in Jamaica. He had no idea where to look for Jason and Jerry. Frustrated, he went down to the beach and got a room for the night. He did nothing but stare out the window until late in the evening. He tried to figure out why Jason and Jerry had left Tampa so quickly. A lot of wild ideas ran through his head, but none of them were viable enough to get stuck there. The only thing left for him to do was go back to Tampa. The following morning, he booked a flight scheduled to leave later that afternoon. He figured once he arrived back in Tampa, he'd go find Candy and talk to her about Roxanne. She would tell him the truth. The whole truth. He counted on it anyway. In the meantime, he needed to blow off some steam. A great way to do that, he figured, was a walk on the beach. Casually, he strolled along the water's edge with his hands in his pockets. Mainly directing his attention out over the water, he wondered what he was going to do now. Silently, he scolded himself for running off on this wild goose chase in the first place. This was definitely one of the dumber things he'd done in quite a while. Turning his attention back up the beach, he mindlessly stared straight ahead. Why did he have this compulsion to see Roxanne? And after all this time? For Christ's sakes, she was married now. To him, of all people. Still, Kirk felt an overwhelming need to see her again just to make sure she was okay. Up the beach about 50 yards, he saw a girl sunbathing. Her light brown hair and long, slender legs reminded him of Roxanne. Stop it. Kirk knew better than to compare other women to Roxanne. But ironically, the closer he got to this girl, the more she looked like Roxanne. Less than 20 feet away, an eerie sensation swept over him. The resemblance was remarkable. Moving closer, the peculiar feeling turned to confusion. This girl was an exact replica of Roxanne. The more he looked at her, the more he realized something. Something that made no sense at all. It was Roxanne. This is impossible. Roxanne was in Florida, in a hospital, in a coma. Roxanne. His weak tone shredded her name. The girl opened her eyes and immediately shaded them from the glare of the sun. Kirk had seen her eyes, though. They definitely belonged to Roxanne. That violet-blue color was virtually impossible to replicate. He'd seen many try and fail. But this wasn't possible. She was supposed to be in a hospital in Florida. What the hell was going on? Roxanne? She sat up. Do I know you? Of course you know me. She covered her eyes with her sunglasses and then stood up. I'm sorry. She shook her head, sounding exasperated. What's your name? It's me. Kirk. She shook her head, saying, I'm sorry, but I don't know you. Roxanne. Roxanne Simon. That's your name, right? Yes, she agreed, but there wasn't a single, solitary hint of recognition in her expression. She truly had no idea who Kirk was.